The early modern history of the Old Swiss Confederacy and its constituent 13 cantons encompasses the time of the 30 Years' War until the French invasion of 1798. The early modern period was characterized by an increasingly aristocratic and oligarchic ruling class as well as frequent economic or religious revolts. This period came to be referred to as the Ancien Régime retrospectively in post-Napoleonic Switzerland. The loosely organized confederation remained generally disorganized and crippled by the religious divisions created by the Swiss Reformation. During this period the Confederation gained formal independence from the Holy Roman Empire with support from France, and had very close relations with France. The early modern period also saw the growth of French-Swiss literature, and notable authors of the Age of Enlightenment such as the mathematicians of the Bernoulli family and Leonhard Euler of Basel. 13 Cantons. The Old Swiss Confederacy between phases of expansion consisted of 8 cantons during 1352 to 1481, and of 13 cantons from 1513 until its collapse in 1798. The 13 cantons thus correspond to the sovereign territories of early modern Switzerland. They were listed in a fixed order of precedence: first the 8 cantons of the 14th century Confederacy, then the 5 cantons which joined after the Burgundian Wars, and within these two groups, the more powerful urban cantons were listed first, with Zurich heading the list as the de facto voort of the 8 cantons prior to the Swiss Reformation. The order of precedence, similar but not identical to the modern order, was as follows: Zurich, city canton, since 1351. Bern, city canton, since 1353, associate since 1323. Lucerne, city canton, since 1332. Uri, founding canton. Schwyz, founding canton. Unterwalden, founding canton. Zug, city canton, since 1352. Glarus, rural canton, since 1352. Basel, city canton, since 1501. Fribourg, city canton, since 1481, associate since 1454. Solothurn, city canton, since 1481, associate since 1353. Schaffhausen, city canton, since 1501, associate since 1454. Appenzell, rural canton, since 1513, associate since 1411. Symbolic depictions of the Confederacy consisted of arrangements of the 13 cantonal coats of arms, sometimes with an additional symbol of unity, such as 2 clasping hands, or the Swiss bull, or the 3 confederates of the Helvetia allegory. The cantonal coats of arms were often accompanied by the coats of arms of the close associates of the Confederacy, including Biel, the Imperial Abbey of St. Gallen, Imperial City of St. Gallen, the Siebenszanden, the Three Leagues, the Imperial City of Mulhouse, the Imperial City of Geneva, and the Imperial City of Rottweil. 30 Years' War. The Reformation in Switzerland left the Old Swiss Confederacy divided between 2 hostile factions, but still, Switzerland remained a relative oasis of peace and prosperity, while Europe was torn by the 30 Years' War. The cities generally lay low and watched the destruction from afar, the Republic of Zurich investing in building state-of-the-art city ramparts. The cantons had concluded numerous mercenary contracts and defense alliances with partners on all sides. Some of these contracts neutralized each other, which allowed the Confederation to remain neutral. In the 1647 Defense Annale von Will, signed under the impression of the Swedes advancing as far as Lake Constance in the winter of 1646–47, the Confederates declared permanent armed neutrality, the historical starting point of Swiss neutrality, which would be reconfirmed by the Congress of Vienna and adhered to throughout the 19th and 20th century conflicts. Treaty of Westphalia. At the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, the Swiss Confederacy attained legal independence from the Holy Roman Empire, although it had been de facto independent since the Swabian War in 1499. With the support of the Duke of Orleans, who was also Prince of Neuchâtel and the head of the French delegation, Johann Rudolf Wettstein, the mayor of Basel, succeeded in getting a formal exemption from the empire for all cantons and associates of the Confederacy. During the 30 Years' War, the Drehbund had been caught in the middle of internal and external conflict. Because the leagues were very decentralized, conflicts over religion and foreign policy broke out during the war. Following the war, the League took steps to strengthen itself. The Valtellina, which had broken from the three leagues, became a dependency once again after the treaty and remained so until the founding of the Cisalpine Republic by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1797. Relationships with France. Following the 30 Years' War, as France grew into a great power in Europe, the newly independent Confederation turned to France for trade and protection. In 1663, the Confederation agreed to a new treaty with France which granted Swiss mercenaries certain rights and protections as well as promised French neutrality in Swiss religious conflicts. However, as a consequence of this treaty, Switzerland could do nothing when Louis XIV took Alsace, Franche-Comté and Strasbourg. Following Louis XIV's revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which granted rights to Protestants, the Protestant cantons began to favor military service with the Protestant Dutch, who were fighting a series of wars against several European powers, including France. In 1707, following the death of Marie de Nemours, Duchesses of Nemours and Princess of Neuchâtel, the city, which was on the border of the Swiss Confederation, had to choose her successor from among 15 claimants, while Louis XIV promoted a number of French pretenders to the title. The Protestant cantons of the Swiss Confederation encouraged Neuchâtel to select the Protestant King Frederick I of Prussia. In a victory for the Protestant half of the Confederation, Frederick I, who claimed his entitlement in a rather complicated fashion through the houses of Orange and Nassau, was selected. In 1715, the Catholic cantons, to regain prestige following the defeat during the Second Battle of Villemergen, renewed the Confederation's treaty with France with several major and unpopular changes. France was placed in the position of the guarantor of the freedom with rights of interfering in case of attack from forces within or without the Confederation. France also promised to procure restitution for the lands lost by the Catholic cantons to the Protestant cantons. This agreement removed much of the independence that the Confederation had enjoyed. In 1777, the unpopular clause was dropped from a renewed agreement between the Confederation and France, and the independence of Switzerland was explicitly stated. Growth of the aristocracy. Political power congealed around the 13 cantons of the old Confederation. During this era, the patrician families decreased in number but increased in power. Some patrician families were drawn from leadership in the guilds or trading groups within the town, while other families grew from successful mercenary captains and soldiers. The trend toward increasing authoritarianism conflicted with the history of public expression that grew out of the Swiss Reformation. In many regions, the patrician families were unable to suppress the public assemblies, but they did dominate the assemblies. The tradition of inviting the people to express their opinions died out mostly during this era. During this time, changes to the membership of city councils became increasingly rare. Throughout the Middle Ages, a seat on the town council was normally a lifetime appointment. However, plagues, battlefield deaths, and conflicts over the Reformation guaranteed a regular turnover in the city councils. During the early modern era, growing scientific knowledge and relative peace reduced the number of open seats in the cities. At the same time, council members were increasingly able to fill the council with relatives. The population in Europe began to expand again following the 30 Years' War. This led to population pressure that hadn't been experienced in several generations. For protection and help against the rising number of immigrants and landless peasants, many villages began to draw closer to neighboring towns, eventually coming under the authority of the larger towns. During the 17th century, seats in the councils became increasingly hereditary. There were between 50 and 200 families that controlled all the key political, military, and industrial positions in Switzerland. In Bern, out of 360 burgher families, only 69 still had any power and could be elected by the end of the 18th century. However, the aristocracy remained generally open, and in some cities new families were accepted if they were successful and rich enough. Conflict and revolution. During the Ancien Régime, the nobility of Switzerland grew in power, becoming nearly absolute rulers. Among the population, the loss of power, growing taxes, conflicts between rural and urban populations, and religious conflicts all lead to uprisings and conflicts throughout the Confederation. During the 30 Years' War, the Swiss Confederacy had been spared from all belligerent action. This allowed the Swiss economy to flourish as war-ravaged neighbors bought food and equipment from the Confederacy. However, following the end of the war, the German economy recovered and demand for Swiss exports dropped. Many Swiss peasants, who had raised mortgages during the boom at wartime, suddenly faced financial problems. For cities, the war had brought both prosperity and new expenses. The cities required new defenses such as new bastions. During the war, France and Spain had paid pensions, the agreed sums, in return for the cantons providing them with mercenary regiments. With the end of the war, this money had to be replaced. Taxes were raised and new ones were created. Additionally, less valuable copper coins called batzen were minted. The batzen had, however, the same face value as the previously minted silver money. The population began hoarding the silver coins, and the cheap copper money that remained in circulation continually lost its purchasing power. At the end of the war, the population thus faced both a post-war depression and a high inflation, combined with high taxes. This financial crisis led to a series of tax revolts in several cantons of the Confederacy. For instance, 1629–36 in Lucerne, 1641 in Bern, or 1645–46 in Zurich. The uprising in 1653 continued this series, but would take the conflict to an unprecedented level. In 1653, the largest uprising occurred as peasants of territories subject to Lucerne, Bern, Solothurn and Basel revolted because of currency devaluation. Although the authorities prevailed in this Swiss peasant war, they did pass some tax reforms, and the incident in the long term prevented creation of an absolutist state. Unlike many of the other states of Europe, the Confederation remained a decentralized and disorganized country during this era, torn by religious and political conflicts. In 1655, an attempt to create a central administration fell apart after the two proposers, Bern and Zurich, couldn't agree with each other. In 1656, a conflict over religious refugees from Schwyz who had fled to Zurich erupted in the First War of Wilmergen. The Catholics were victorious and able to maintain the political dominance, and a treaty agreement that each canton would be totally independent with respect to religious matters. Around 1707, unrest erupted in the city of Geneva, which continued throughout the early modern period. Additionally, in 1707, the Toggenburg Valley rebelled against the Principate of St. Gall. Attempts by the abbot to suppress the valley led to the Second Battle of Vilmergen in 1712 and the sacking of the Abbey of St. Gall by Bernese and Zurich troops. From 1719 to 22 the Württemberg region rebelled against the city of Glarus. In 1717 Major Jean Daniel Abraham Davel was appointed the commander of the Liver region, which is in modern-day Canton Vaud. He identified with the French-speaking population that felt oppressed by the German-speaking city of Bern that occupied Vaud. Davel believed that he had been called by God to free the inhabitants of Vaud from Bern. On the 31st of March 1723 he mobilized 600 men and marched on Lausanne to ask for city leaders to revolt with him. However, they reported him to Bern and arrested him on the next morning. He was judged guilty of treason and beheaded. About a quarter-century later, in 1749, there was another unsuccessful uprising in Bern against the patrician families of the city. A few years later, in 1755, the unsuccessful Livina uprising against Uri. Finally, in 1781, the Chenot uprising occurred against the city of Fribourg. Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment was well received in Swiss cities, in spite of contemporary tendencies towards political conservatism. The early modern period was a time when Swiss science and literature flowered. In Zurich, the scholar and physician Johann Jacob Schweitzer wrote about Swiss history, geology, geography and science. In Basel, the Bernoulli family and Leonhard Euler worked on mathematics and physics, coming up with some fundamental concepts in these fields. Albrecht von Haller and Jean-Jacques Rousseau praised the natural beauty and unspoiled state of Switzerland and triggered an early wave of tourism. Zurich at the time was home to a number of internationally known scholars, such as Johann Jacob Bodmer, Salomon Gessner, Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi and Johann Caspar Lavater, styling itself as «Republic». Culture during the early modern period. Before the early modern period, most of the literature of the Swiss Confederation was either in Latin or German, as until 1798 the Confederation was overwhelmingly German with only small pockets of French. During the early modern period, German still dominated, though French, Italian and Romansh began to develop literary traditions within the boundaries of modern Switzerland. German writings in the 18th century. The intellectual movement in Switzerland greatly developed, though it was naturally strongly influenced by local characteristics. Basel, Bern and especially Zurich were the chief literary centers. Basel was distinguished for its mathematicians, such as Leonhard Euler, and three members of the Bernoulli family, the brothers Jacob and Johann, and the latter's son Daniel. But its chief literary glory was Isaac Iserlohn, one of the founders of the Helvetic Society and of the Economical Society. He wrote about the philosophy of history, ideal politics and economics. In Bern, both German and French were commonly used in writing, making the separation of Bernese authors into one category difficult. Albrecht von Haller wrote both scientific works as well as poems which praised the beauty of the countryside. His son, Gottlieb Emanuel von Haller, compiled a useful bibliography of writings relating to Swiss history, which is still used today. Beat Ludwig von Muralt analyzed, in French, the racial characteristics of other nations for the instruction of his fellow countrymen. Samuel Wittenbach, Gottlieb Sigmund Gruner and Johann Georg Altmann all wrote descriptions of the countryside in a combination of literary and scientific styles. In Zurich, J.J. Schweitzer wrote in Latin of his travels around the country, and shared them with the London Royal Society, of which he was a fellow. He associated closely closely with other fellows of the Royal Society, including Isaac Newton, J.J. Bodmer and his friend Johann Jacob Breitinger were among the most prominent purely literary writers in the city. Another famous Zurich writer was Solomon Gesner, the pastoral poet, and yet another was J.K. Lavater, now best remembered as a supporter of the view that the face presents a perfect indication of character and that physiognomy may therefore be treated as a science. Other well-known Zurich names are those of J.H. Pestalozzi, the educationalist, of Hans Caspar Herzl, another of the founders of the Helvetic Society, and of Johann Georg Sulzer, whose chief work is one on the laws of art or aesthetics. Outside the three towns named above there were several significant writers of German-speaking Switzerland. One of the best known is Johann Georg Zimmermann, whose Betrachtung and Fiber die Einsamkeit profoundly impressed his contemporaries. He, like the fabulous De Ehrlich, was born at Brugg. Johannes von Müller of Schaffhausen was the first who attempted to write a detailed history of Switzerland, which, though inspired more by his love of freedom than by any deep research, was very characteristic of his times. J.G. Ebel was a Swiss by adoption only, but deserves mention as the author of the first detailed guidebook to the country, which held its ground till the days of Murray and Baedeker. A later writer, Heinrich Z. Schocker, also a Swiss by adoption only, produced a history of Switzerland written for the people, which had a great vogue. French writing. The 18th century was the golden age for Swiss literature. This was due to the influence of French refugees who came to Switzerland after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. Among the refugees was Louis Berger, who wrote geological works and founded two periodicals that provided Italian research and works by French-Swiss authors to the country. Abraham Rachat, who was published in Berger's periodicals, is best known as the author of an excellent guidebook to Switzerland, which was published from 1714 until 1778. Around the same time, the historian Charles-Guillaume Loys de Bochat and the philosopher J.P. de Crousaz were working the Vaud region, which was at the time part of the canton of Bern. A French refugee at Lausanne, Jean Barbeyrac, published in 1712 a translation of Samuel von Pufendorf's works on natural law. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Burlamaqui and the celebrated international lawyer Émeric de Vattel were natives of Neuchâtel, though de Vattel only returned to die in the city. The second half of the 18th century was when some of the best-known writers of the era established themselves in what would become French Switzerland. In 1754 the famed philosopher Rousseau came back for good to Geneva, and Voltaire established himself at Ferney, while in 1753 the historian Edward Gibbon moved to Lausanne. These three, while the works were not specifically Swiss, lead the golden age of French literature in Switzerland. Also during this time there were other active writers. Madame de Charrière was Dutch by birth, but married to a native of Neuchâtel. She wrote of sad results of an unsuitable marriage and set her books in highly detailed small provincial towns. Paul Henry Mallet, a Genevesher who held a chair at Copenhagen, devoted himself to making known to the educated world the history and antiquities of Scandinavia. During the mid and late 18th century, Geneva produced a number of scientists who were interested in the characteristics of the Alps. The chief of this school was Horace Benedict de Saussure, one of the founders of the sciences of geology and meteorology. While his Alpine ascents opened a new world even to non-scientific travelers, Jean-André Deluc devoted himself mainly to questions of physics in the Alps, while Jean Saint-Niebert, the biographer of Saussure, was more known as a physiologist than as a physicist, though he wrote on many branches of natural science, which in those days was not yet highly specialized. On the other hand, Mark Theodor Burrit, the contemporary of these three men, was rather a curious and inquisitive traveler than a scientific investigator, and charms us even there by his genial simplicity as contrasted with the austerity and gravity of the three writers we have mentioned. In Vaud, at this time part of the Canton of Bern, nationalist feelings among the French-speaking inhabitants and against the German-speaking Bern administration began to grow. Philippe Sériac-Bridel began writing poetry in 1782 and is considered the earliest Vaudois poet. His descriptions of his travels around the Vaud region were published in serial form for nearly 50 years, from 1783 until 1831. His paintings and written portraits of the Vaud countryside inspired a number of later writers and helped unify the nationalist movement in Vaud. Bibliography. Albert Hauser was für ein Leben, Schweizer Alltag vom 15. bis 18. Jahrhundert, Verlag Neue Zürcher Zeitung, 1987, ISBN 978-3-85823-179-6.